Yeah, sign here.
Question. If you were given the chance to take home a bunch of life-size wax figures of notorious killers and keep them in your basement, would you do it?
When you live with them, as long as I have, you come to love them.
You're traveling to another dimension. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Today, our Twilight Zone Review Marathon continues with one of the more macabre entries in this series, the new exhibit. Now, being a horror fan myself, I've been looking forward to this one for a while. All of the necessary elements for a creepy Twilight Zone are in place.
Tell us about it. Well,
first off, we have a collection of murderous wax figures. Many of us have visited wax museums and probably found ourselves morbidly curious to check out the darker corners of the exhibitions. Typically, these sections warn viewers about the distressing nature of the subject matter. And what's interesting about the new exhibit is not only does Jack the Ripper feature prominently, but other real-world killers also come into play. And that's an aspect which grounds the story and makes it feel a lot more ominous. Before we begin, as always, spoilers are ahead, but I wanted to mention I'll also be touching on Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. That film is an all-time classic, so if by chance you haven't seen Psycho, I'll let you know before I get to it. But for now, let's check in with Rod Serling and see what he has to say.
Martin Lombard Sinescu, a gentleman, the dedicated curator of Murderers Row in Ferguson's Wax Museum. He ponders the reasons why ordinary men are driven to commit mass murder. What Mr. Sinescu does not know is that the groundwork has already been laid for his own special kind of madness and torment, found only in the Twilight Zone.
The new exhibit was episode 13 from season 4, and since this was a 4th season episode, that means the new exhibit also happens to be one of the extended hour-long episodes. So that's an extra helping of creepiness. The new exhibit was directed by John Bram, and even though the writing was fully credited to Charles Beaumont, by this point in the show's run, Beaumont was suffering the effects of Alzheimer's. Beaumont came up with the basic concept, but the script was actually ghostwritten by Jerry Saul, who on occasion would fill in for Beaumont when it came to writing chores. Although it took time for Saul to receive the proper credit he deserves for his contributions to the Fifth Dimension, he made a name for himself anyway. Saul wrote several novels, movie scripts, and he had writing credits on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Outer Limits, and one of my favorite Star Trek episodes, The Corbomite Maneuver. The new exhibit stars Martin Balsam as Martin Sinescu, curator of the Murderers Row exhibit. Martin is a fascinating character, and I think even early on we get the sense that something lurks beneath the surface of this so-called gentleman. In fact, we quickly learn that Martin has a pretty disturbing obsession with the wax figures that he cares for.
Just look at the mouth. Isn't it about to say something?
As previously mentioned, these figures do include Jack the Ripper, but also other real-life killers, Albert W. Hicks, the French Bluebeard, Henri Désiré Landru, William Burke, and William Hare.
There's nothing to be afraid of, they're just a lot of wax.
Perhaps not, young man. Who knows what evil lurks in the heart of the man standing next to you?
Fellow Bronx-born Martin Balsam is certainly one of the more renowned actors to appear in the series. He had an impressive career, winning an Academy Award for his role in 1,000 Clowns, and he appeared in countless noteworthy films as well. As many Twilight Zone fans already know, Martin Balsam was important to the legacy of the show. Aside from prominent roles in 2 classic episodes, he also featured in the Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse production, The Time Element. That show was viewers' first true glimpse into what would become Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. And Balsam even appeared in 2 1980s Twilight Zone segments. But in my view, this episode featured his finest work.
Thank you.
Everything about the opening scene when Martin is given his typical tour feels realistic. We have a young couple, easily spooked, and others who seem to just be there for a good time.
Get away from there!
Beyond simply being passionate about his job, Martin seems to display empathy for the killers on Murderers Row, which is disturbing.
To take a life with your hands, again and again, and not be able to stop oneself. Can you begin to imagine the horror of that?
Martin's fascination with this collection of murderers, and the idea that they'll be remembered for all time, is a central theme in the story. there's clearly a darkness brewing inside Martin that feels suppressed. And I get the sense that his obsession with these wax figures is his emotional outlet.
I never dreamed I'd see this day.
The story really kicks into gear when the museum owner, as played by Will Kaluva, tells Martin he's going to be closing the museum down. Naturally, Martin can't bear to be separated from the figures he's spent years tending to. And with that, Martin offers to take the figures home where he can continue to care for them. I have to note, it's almost humorous how casually Martin shrugs off how his wife will feel about this insane endeavor.
What would Emma say to having the figures of 5 famous murderers in her basement? Emma wouldn't mind. She would understand.
We'll see about that. Anyway, what follows is a chilling tale that takes us into one of the more unsettling areas of the fifth dimension.
You cleaned that cape last week.
Once Martin has his figures home and his wife and other players enter the picture, the strain of this bizarre situation becomes clear.
Honestly, Martin, you've been paying more attention to these murderers than you ever did to me.
Martin's wife Emma, as portrayed by Maggie Mahoney, does a great job here. She offers up a genuine performance in this difficult role as the stable half of the relationship.
Oh, Martin, we can't go on this way.
Maggie Mahoney is best known for her work in 2 notable sci-fi films, The Man from Planet X and Captive Women. Although she was billed here as Maggie Mahoney, she's probably more familiar as Margaret Field, the mother of Oscar-winning actress Sally Field.
Good morning. How'd you spend the night, Jack?
As the tale progresses, Martin's behavior becomes increasingly unhinged. He locks himself down in a basement all day, and despite being out of work, he carelessly runs up the electric bill. As it turns out, the basement has to be cozy and cool to better preserve his murderous new toys. With the air conditioner blasting away constantly, and the bills piling up, Emma loses her patience.
This is the first time anything has come between us.
Eventually, Emma confides in her brother Dave, as played by William Mims. Dave suggests that Emma simply get rid of the figures. With that, one night Emma sneaks down to the basement to turn up the cold air. However, getting rid of these guys isn't going to be that easy. The next morning, Martin finds Emma's body and comes to realize she was killed by one of his favorite wax pals. To be clear, this episode is a bit of a slow burn. But all the same, the story kept my interest, even in the early portion, and more so once we cross over into this Twilight Zone territory. After all, the possibility of wax killers springing to life is more than fitting for the Twilight Zone, a place where everything from a child's doll to a dummy can wreak havoc. It's also at this point in the episode that any hope for Martin's redemption went down the drain. Instead of calling the police or instantly destroying the figures, Martin goes down a sinister path. He buries his wife's body under the floor of the basement, rationalizing that the police would never believe him if he told them the truth. Later, when Emma's brother comes looking for her, he too is killed, this time by Albert Hicks. Martin covers up that murder as well. So as these grim events play out, I found that the new exhibit became something else entirely. No longer was Martin just an oddball caring for wax figures and driving his wife nuts. Now Martin was part of something far more gruesome.
Martin!
In the conclusion of the episode, Martin's old boss visits with news that he's found a buyer for the figures. However, as soon as Martin turns his back and heads off, Landrew comes to life and chokes Mr. Ferguson to death. For those of you keeping track, that's 3 dead bodies. So this Twilight Zone actually has a body count, just like any slasher movie.
Mr. Ferguson.
Once again, Martin discovers the body, but this time he decides he's had enough and the figures have to be destroyed.
The books are right, you are monsters. You're heartless monsters. All of you, through and through.
I actually find it interesting that this was Martin's reaction after finding his boss had been killed, as opposed to his wife. But hey, at least he finally came to his senses. Well, sort of. Because we do get a trademark Twilight Zone twist, and it's revealed that Martin has actually been the killer all along.
No, Martin Sinescu, it was you. You murdered your wife.
As Martin realizes the truth, the figures descend on him. Much later on, we find ourselves at Marchand's Wax Museum. where a new figure has been added to the murderer's row, Martin Lombard Senescu, having finally achieved the infamy he obsessed over in life.
The new exhibit became very popular at Marchand's. But of all the figures, none was ever regarded with more dread than that of Martin Lombard Senescu. It was something about the eyes, people said. It's the look that one often gets after taking a quick walk through the Twilight Zone.
First off, let's discuss the conclusion, which is a deal breaker for some viewers. Most notably, in the Twilight Zone Companion, Mark Scott Zickery states that the ending falls short in that there's not enough subtlety or ambiguity in the lead up to the reveal. Throughout the story, we witness the murders committed by the wax figures. When Martin is sleeping or off to get some tea, the wax figures seem to spring to life and begin killing. The twist still mostly works for me. My take is that if Martin was in fact the killer, which seems to be what this episode is trying to tell us, then maybe some of the questionable events that we see in the episode are simply part of his delusion. Essentially, the wax figures step up and do the dirty work that deep down he feels needs to be done.
Hicks, how could you?
That at least helps explain away some of the inconsistencies in the narrative, but I am still unsure how to interpret whatever the hell is happening when the killers descend upon Martin. Another reason I enjoyed this episode overall was its similarities to Psycho, which is one of my favorite Hitchcock films. That said, I'll now be going into key moments from that film, so feel free to skip ahead to this timestamp if you want to avoid any spoilers from Psycho. Okay, now, when Martin finds the dead bodies and reacts in horror, it was eerily reminiscent of Norman Bates pretty much doing the same thing. Despite the fact that both Norman and Martin commit crimes, both men psychologically detach themselves from their acts altogether. In modern times, it's been suggested that Norman Bates suffered from dissociative identity disorder. The film indicates that Norman's identity is lost when he takes on the persona of his mother. Similarly, in this episode, it would seem Martin's identity is lost when he takes on the identities of these killers. For me, of course, another bonus is the fact that Martin Balsam also appears in Psycho.
The monsters of their time.
I have to credit the actors who actually managed to stand still for all these scenes. As noted over at Twilight Zone Vortex, to achieve the subtle effects of the figures, makeup and still photography was utilized for frames in which the figures are completely frozen. But the actors do their best to remain still during the scenes in which the other performers interact with the figures.
Whoever made these up, they thought of everything. Even put blood on the knife.
I've already mentioned how much I enjoyed Martin Balsam's performance. His work here is top-notch, but I also want to give credit to two of the supporting players who helped bring this creepy tale to life. First up, we have Will Kaluva, who portrayed Mr. Ferguson.
Our pièce de résistance, if I may say so.
Kaluva doesn't get a whole lot to do here, but he leaves an impression and brings an energy that works as a perfect contrast against Martin, who's far more of a quiet oddball. Fans may recognize Kaluva from the Season 3 Twilight Zone, The Mirror.
There is something else.
And lastly, there's William Mims, the only player here who offered some levity in this otherwise grim episode.
Must have been a pretty hot night last night, huh?
What do you mean?
Pretty hot for a bunch of wax dummies, huh?
Mims may be familiar to some for his appearances in shows such as The Beverly Hillbillies, Boris Karloff's Thriller, and Night Gallery. He also appeared in a 1967 cult hit, Hot Rods to Hell. And yes, he brought back that trademark laugh for that one as well.
Look out for those 30-mile zones. They're murder.
Interestingly, Hot Rods to Hell was the final film directed by John Bram, the very same director of this episode.
Martin Lombard Senescu, remarkable and certainly most versatile murderer.
Well, that's it for me. Obviously, the new exhibit is another one I highly recommend. This is a haunting tale that does a great job mixing together elements of classic horror, psychological drama, and even a sprinkle of Hitchcock vibes for good measure. I'd rate the new exhibit 4 out of 5 freaking out Martin Balsam. Thanks for watching, everyone. I appreciate it. If you've seen the new exhibit and have your own thoughts or more facts and trivia to add regarding this one, feel free to share below. And if you enjoyed this review, stay tuned. There's a lot more to come from the Fifth Dimension. Take care, be well, later.
You proud of that? The way you keep waving it around?
You hear that, boy? Your mama is a real joker, huh?